So if I use the words Iran or impeachment or African swine fever, that can instantly take you to this concept, the edge of chaos. The edge of chaos is a sensation that we all have in this modern moment, in the present day. And just like in the very opening of what we heard today, people feel like we are at an unprecedented time right now. I would actually make the case that we will always feel like we are in an unprecedented time. And I think that this is an ancient feeling that all of us have had as individuals, but even as cultures. And I think that that's well symbolized in this idea right here. You know, when I was young, and I grew up in small town central Illinois, when I saw this image, I always imagined, or I thought, of a very low fidelity concept about what this could mean. I always thought that the white was good and the black was evil, and that these were two opposing forces that pushed on one another, and that was just the way the world was. So to me, that explained maybe the entirety of this philosophy and this way of looking at the world. But as an adult, when I went to become the director of millennial engagement for perhaps the most controversial company on the face of the earth, I had to go look deeper into the world to figure out, why is all of this chaos happening? How can you have a company and a technology and an industry that is as vilified as agriculture? And that's when I came to a different understanding of what this symbol means. And it's one that I think will interest all of you in this room. You see, I don't think that it is just good versus evil. I think it's actually the dichotomy of order and chaos. Order is something that everyone in this room is highly attuned to. In fact, you couldn't be in this room if you did not know how to put things in straight lines, how to make habits, how to do the things and get everything done in order to build wealth such that you could buy, own, or make property productive. The chaos is something a little different. The chaos is not what everyone knows and understands, the world that they already know how to navigate. The chaos is everything in the world that you don't know and you don't understand. Now, it's easy to imagine in the beginning that where you want to be is the ordered side of the world. But the problem with the ordered side of the world, if you just stay on that side of your dichotomy, particularly where you're comfortable, nothing new comes out. In fact, order ends up becoming tyrannical because it means we can never change. Now, the People's Company has clearly put together an event where what they want to do is to push you into the chaos a bit. Because all these new ideas that are good and usable and able to change not just how you're thinking, but how your decisions impact the wider world, is if you get on the exact edge between those two, the edge of chaos. This is where all new things come. It's where you're pushing yourself on how much you already know what you're capable of, and you encounter new things that you didn't expect. 5 years ago, I encountered chaos that I did not expect. You see, I had been a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer, a deckhand on an ecotourism ship. I ran a camp for inner city kids. I worked at the World Bank. I even worked at a national public radio station in Mendocino, California. For anybody in here that doesn't know where Mendocino, California is, it's, you know where Berkeley is, right? The people that think Berkeley is too conservative, they move up to Mendocino. And I was working in public radio up there. So when I received from a friend of mine an invitation to go interview for the job, Director of Millennial Engagement, I thought this was hilarious, right? Who in their right mind would ever do a job for a company that all of those tribes that I went to and lived in, whether it was the Peace Corps or the World Bank or public radio, every single person that I knew that Monsanto was evil. So I saw an opportunity when I had an invitation to interview there. I thought, well, if I accept the invitation, who doesn't want to see inside of North Korea? So I took the invitation to go interview. And after 7 hours of interviews, we get all the way through to the end. And I don't know if any of you have ever been in a job interview for a job that you don't want. it is about as much fun as you can have, right? Because you don't care what you say. So they will ask you a question. What's your management style? What time do you like to come into work? And I would answer that question quickly and efficiently. And then I would say, why are you poisoning the Mississippi River? What's going on with these Indian farmer suicides? So I go through this battery of interviews and I am bashing these people as hard as I can. I didn't know them. To me, they were just a faceless corporation. But we get all the way to the end of the interview, and the woman who had invited me in says, she comes back into the room and she looks across the table from me and she says, okay, we're done with the interview now. Do you have any remaining questions for me? And I kind of smiled and I said, yeah, I got a question for you. You are representing a company that people believe is actually evil. They are doing dark things in the world as far as the population knows, and you're going to hire a person to go out and talk with them? No one's ever done this before. How are you planning on training this person? And she paused, and then what she said next changed the trajectory of my life. It's why I'm standing in front of you right here. She said, well, you know, since you've been so curious during this interview, I think what I would do if we hired you, we would specially design the training so that we would have you go out and talk with 50 people from throughout the company, geneticists, breeders, farmers, lawyers, and have you go talk with each one of them for an hour. And when you get done with that list of 50 people, you'll sit down with me, we'll figure out what you do and don't know, and I'll write you another list of 50 people. And right then, it clicked off in my mind, they are about to give me an opportunity they could not possibly understand how valuable it is to a person like me. You see, because I'm going to get to run around this company, and I'm going to get to ask them anything that I want. And if I discover that they are as evil as everyone says that they are, then I am going to go write the greatest tell-all book of all time. But if I'm wrong, if actually my interpretation, the world that I knew walking in here was not correct, well then you've maybe just stumbled upon the most important problem in the history of modern civilization, which is we are growing food more bountifully than we ever have in the history of time, and yet people are afraid and even angry about where their food comes from, and no one knows how to stop it. And so that led me to taking this job. And by going into the chaos, this place that I didn't know and understand, I got to see inside of a world about how change happens in a society. Why is it that some ideas get so much steam that even though they're not credible, they become a part of who we are? And I'm going to do that by explaining that I am actually not the speaker that was hired to come here. In fact, this man right here, Dr. Kevin Folta, who is the former head of horticulture studies at the University of Florida and is one of the most decorated scientists and science communicators in the entire world. He travels all over Switzerland, Uganda, throughout the United States, talking with people about biotechnology, how it works, why they shouldn't be afraid of it, what they can do to try and help farmers be able to use the type of technology on their farms that they know they could use to make the world better. But 2 years ago, Kevin came in contact with a group of people that didn't like his message. And they disliked it so much that they spent the next 2 years relentlessly attacking his reputation, his university, his work. And finally, a few months ago, his university said, you know what? We don't care if it's not your fault. We're tired of getting all these phone calls. We're tired of having all this attention brought up, so we're pulling it back. And you cannot go out and give the speeches that you were planning to give. So the outrage culture that exists today has impacted the people in this room. Now for me, I'm glad I'm here because we can talk about what happened to Kevin, but I can tell you, you missed out because this is one of the greatest science communicators alive today. So I want to talk about how is it that people are able to drive decisions, people that were never going to be at this conference, people that had nothing at all to do with it, why is it that they get to determine what it is that you hear? The ideas that you're exposed to, what you're allowed to believe. And I think of this in terms of waves of culture. So today I'm going to talk about two concepts, the Overton window and the intransigent minority. The reason I want to bring these ideas up to you is because once you have a name, once you can define what is going on, you can react to it better. That's both on a personal level, but also on a professional level. As you can understand how new ideas get pushed into a society, you can decide, is this an idea I want to ignore, or is this where I need to draw a line in the sand? And it begins with this concept right here called the Overton Window. The Overton Window is a concept that describes what is the window of acceptable thought that you're allowed to have in a given culture or a different community. Now, we all know that there are certain ideas that are completely outside of the Overton Window, unthinkable. So imagine, for example, if somebody had stood up here and instead of saying, hey, we're going to put together a good portfolio, we're going to balance it, we're going to go find investors and try and find buyers, if somebody said, we're going to go collect as many guns as we can and we're just going to go take that land. Right? That's an unthinkable idea. That's not even going to get started. And anybody that had that idea, that was seriously trying to put it up, you would push out of your community. Now, the opposite of an unthinkable idea is the very center of the Overton Window, which is policy. And this can mean policy in terms of formal policy, laws, trade negotiations, or it can mean this is the status quo, this is how we behave in this culture. Now, if we go back to the outside, there are some ideas that are radical. And probably there are people in this room that have radical ideas. Radical doesn't mean bad, it just means way outside the thoughts that the rest of the community is allowed to entertain. And in between radical and policy, you see that some ideas are acceptable, some seem sensible to people, some are even popular. As you get closer and closer to that center, more and more people are on board with it. Now, let's put this into real practice. So, for example, on one pole, you could have this idea, veganism. And on the other pole, you could have this concept called the carnivore diet. Is there anybody in here that has heard of the carnivore diet in here? Very few, right? It seems so radical that I think it actually would be an unthinkable idea. If any of you go home and you tell your spouses, I'm done with fruits and vegetables, I'm only eating bacon and steaks from now on, it's a part of my diet, I'm pretty sure your spouse would think that was unthinkable, right? But veganism on this other pole was at one time unthinkable. In fact, I can remember when my aunt wrote my mother to say, in a few weeks, we're going to be visiting your home. I wanted to let you know I'm vegan. And my mother having a near meltdown because she had no idea that it was possible to cook without using animal products. It had never crossed her mind. It was a completely radical idea. But it's moved further into society. And now, if you were to ask anybody in this room, you have a general idea. We have a speaker that's going to talk about plant-based diets. It is not so unthinkable as it was even just a few years ago. And the carnivore diet, while I'm standing up here saying this and we can get a little bit of a chuckle out of this, this is actually being practiced by people. You can go on Twitter and you can find someone like Carnivore Aurelius, who all his entire Twitter feed is about why you should only be eating meat. Or the most popular podcaster in the world right now, Joe Rogan, has just started announcing that he is practicing the carnivore diet. So it is an idea that is moving more from unthinkable into the radical space. But if we look at veganism, we know that's no longer a radical idea. This is actually an idea that has pushed its way into society such that there are schools, school districts, towns that are applying Meatless Monday as a form of policy. And most of the world says, I don't want to eat vegan, but they bring up some good points. Maybe we should make some changes. So the question is, why is it that veganism has been able to push into society? And do you think that the carnivore diet will have that same effect? Will we soon have a day in our schools where the children can only eat meat? Probably not. Why is it that one side is going to push into society and not the other? So when we think about this Overton window, most people are okay with the policy. That Bell distribution represents the fraction of people that are into an idea depending on how far outside of the center of the policy it is. The further you get out, the more radical the ideas. But there's an interesting phenomena that happens. There is an inverse relationship between the number of people that believe a radical idea and how strong their emotion is. The further you get out on the polls, the only way you can stay there is if you get yourself into a community of people that also believe that same way, and you keep reinforcing the same story over and over and over again. We need to make this change because of this reason and that reason. And that level of focus on the narrative that you care about drives up your emotion, which is why 2 or 3 people can sit on Twitter focused all day on a single hashtag, poking it, and everyone will be like, did you see how many people were upset on social media about this? When really it was just 3 highly motivated people. This brings me to an idea that was brought forward by a man named Nassim Taleb. Now, Nassim Taleb is famous for having written the book The Black Swan. He's a mathematician, and he has ideas that are very radical, very outside of the norm. I found myself reading hundreds and hundreds of pages of Nassim Taleb because he is a deep critic of genetic engineering. And so I find it very valuable to find the smartest person that you disagree with and understand their point of view, because that helps you figure out how should I react to what's going on here. Now, one day I came across this article called "The Most Intolerant Wins: The Dictatorship of the Small Minority." In this article, which would probably take the people in this room about 15 minutes to read, he explains how culture is not actually created by what everybody agrees with. It's actually the changes to society always come when there is a group of people, usually on the edges, that believe in an idea so deeply, so much, that they will not rest, they will not have their opinions changed. So they are going to force that change into the world, or they're going to run into a wall. And he calls them the intransigent minority, the people that cannot be reasoned with. They will not change their understanding of the world. Now, this is important because in the world, if you go out and let's say you're at a PTA conference, you've decided you're going to contribute brownies to it. You go to the store, you pick out from those things, the boxes, I like this one, the color, the shape, the price, I'm going to buy this one, and I bring the brownies to the group, and now they can sell them so they can put on a play at the school. However, there's one other parent that shows up at this bake sale, and they find out that you chose the brownies with the GMOs in them, and they will not have it. They believe that that's poison and that it's not worth it to sell it to people, that it's making the world sicker, and so they start throwing a fit, bashing their hands on the table. No, you can't have brownies here made with GMOs. I will not accept this. Maybe they change right there in the moment, or maybe everybody ignores it. But the next time that you go to the grocery store, you're sitting there looking at the brownies, and you don't care whether there were GMOs in there or not. But you know that if you choose the non-GMO brownies, you don't have to worry about that crazed parent anymore, which is you making a choice to avoid the conflict, and it moves the idea into the Overton window one step further. He calls this the intransigent minority, and I think it is very important to name this group. And it's not to say that all intransigent minorities are bad or wrong. It's just to say that this is how ideas get forced into society, because these people are driven by their emotion and the small cluster of people that agree with them. And I could not believe it when you were talking about the definition of sustainability. This is incredibly important, particularly for the people that own the land in the United States. The one who controls the definition controls the argument. The intransigent minority wants to grab control of every single different definition that you have and change it so that only their answer will be the one that's allowed. It's why these boring conversations about words like sustainability are of deep importance. Because if you give up the ground because you say, look, I don't really care about how we define it, we're just going to keep doing what we do, if that word keeps crowding over, eventually a radical idea can become a part of society. This also comes up with other ideas like diversity. Whoever defines what is diversity now gets to decide whether you are diverse enough. This is very important, because if people get to define how your world is shaped based on them controlling the definition, you are just being blown in the winds of the intransigent minority. Now, this fact has not been lost on marketers. People have figured out not only do we have this intransigent minority, but social media has allowed their rage, their emotion, their feelings about things to be hugely amplified. And so what you can do is you can pick a topic and you can market around it. And so this is a graphic right here of the Wikipedia pages of corn syrup. People going to look up the words corn syrup. It's fascinating because I wish you could see it a little closer, but that date is February of 2019. And all of a sudden it spikes way up. Anybody know why? Super Bowl ad. Now here's the funny thing about this Super Bowl ad and this giant spiking of the number of people going to check that Wikipedia page out. The day of the Super Bowl is not when that spike occurred. That spike occurred the day after the Super Bowl. What happened the day after the Super Bowl to spike everyone's attention? The farmers got involved. They got angry and they said, this is an outrage that you would denigrate corn syrup. You shouldn't have done that. So now an ad program that would have been considered a failure because it didn't get people to pay attention, now because it caused conflict with the farmers, people all over the world started paying attention. It was run in all the newspapers. That was probably the most famous ad of that year, but it didn't happen the day of. It happened the day afterwards because the outrage was monetized. Now, because you are all businessmen and women and you're savvy and you're sharp, you may start considering, maybe I should play this game. Maybe I should drive the value of my things up based on the intransigent minority. Maybe I can get a group of people really riled up about something and I can convert that into money. And as the director of millennial engagement for Monsanto, I can tell you that these thoughts were definitely on my mind. Maybe I can take an idea, make it a little oversimplified, spike the ball and make everybody pay attention. But then I came across this book called Trust Me, I'm Lying by a man named Ryan Holiday. This book, written in 2012, describes precisely what is going on with the media. How is it that the internet, people writing blogs, people putting things out on Twitter, how is it that they actually make money? And what happens if you play the outrage game? Because you can only play that game so many times before the chaos comes for you. And so I would recommend not doing that, but I would recommend, if you want to see what's going on the edge of culture, read this book because it will give you an insight into media. And without it, you can't look through the lens of what you're being told is news without understanding their motivations. This brings me to the concept of glyphosate. Now, when I was at Monsanto, my initial purview 5 years before had nothing to do with glyphosate. In fact, 5 years ago, glyphosate was not on the chopping block. Very, very few people were worried about it. We were focused on GMOs. But as the culture began to change and began to accept genetic engineering, the activists that wanted to be able to change the way certain people are farming switched their focus from genetic engineering to glyphosate. And this became a very interesting strategy. I'm not sure if they had it all along or if it's one that was just an emergent phenomenon. But it came out that there are all of these groups, these attorneys, that get together and they go looking for opportunities to be able to bring a suit to trial. And when they have an opportunity, they go to a conference that's not too dissimilar from the shape and size of this, only it's in Las Vegas and it happens in the Bellagio and it happens twice a year. And at this conference, hedge funds and investment portfolio managers, along with people that are selling daytime television ads and billboards, and doctors groups and attorneys groups all get together and they say, we've found a group of people that we think had got cancer from that chemical there. So you can invest in our fund and we will use that money to drive up the number of people that are in this lawsuit by running ads on Judge Judy and putting billboards out in the world. And if we end up winning this case, we will give you a payout. This is a major change to the way that our legal system is set up. And it is attacking something like glyphosate. Now, people in this room may have no connection at all with glyphosate other than maybe it's used on your farm or maybe it's used on a farm down the road from you. But there's an interesting thing. If you can knock out glyphosate, probably the safest chemical that we've used as effectively as we have, if you can knock that out, there is no chemical that we use in farming that you couldn't knock out. Which brings me to this man right here. This man's named Eric Ward. He has a degree in biology from Duke University and a PhD from Washington University. He's run some of the most interesting and intriguing biotech companies in the world. And I was watching one of the speeches that he gave, and he made it a point. He said it's effectively impossible to practice no-till agriculture without using chemical herbicides. Now, in some small situations, or if you have access to huge volumes of labor, maybe you could do it. But the fact that glyphosate could get knocked out could actually mean that for the rest of the time that you own land, you have to go out and till. You have to drag a rake across there or a spike and pull open the soil, throw the carbon in the air, and expose yourself to the risk of having a giant rain event wash away tens of thousands of years of topsoil right there at the front. So even if you don't care about the lawsuit itself, we should all see that when you can rile the intransigent minority to take over the legal system and start charging money there, then it has knock-on effects. So now I want to talk about the levels of analysis. In every single community that you have, everyone that goes from your church to your school district to your region, all the way up on the national level, you can find these Overton windows. Now, it's not possible for me to show you all the different places where conflict is occurring, but I thought I would show you 3 as a way of getting you to think about where there is conflict going on, because it is at those points of conflict where new ideas are either going to get shoved into society or society sees them and says, hey, that's a pretty good idea. I want to accept that into my way of thinking. So let's look at some different levels of analysis. On the tribal level, at least in agriculture, there are people like this man right here, Jared McDaniel. Jared McDaniel is probably the fastest growing ag podcaster in the United States right now. He's a cattle rancher from Texahoma, Oklahoma, and he has decided that he wants to run a podcast called Ag Uncensored, where he goes and finds the most controversial ideas that are hitting together and go and interview the people. So when the fair cattle market prices came out on Twitter, when people were upset about how much they were getting for their cattle, he brought on the leaders of RCAF, NCBA, and U.S. Cattlemen and had them each do a 2-hour interview. It's fascinating. But to somebody outside of agriculture, it wouldn't be that interesting. But every single person in this room, if your land has anything at all to do with livestock, would find the way that the checkoff dollars are being spent and who's representing the farmers and who's representing the packers to be infinitely fascinating. The same is true of this concept called the low population mafia, which is a group of farmers that are saying, we want to plant radically less seeds and we think we can get just as much growth. Now, it doesn't matter whether or not these ideas are right or wrong. It's that by going to places like Ag Uncensored with Jared McDaniel, you have a chance to see where these ideas, this edge of chaos is, which ideas are going to make it into the future. The next is the national level. And this is where I'm going to challenge you to do something that might be really uncomfortable for you. You see, if you are getting all of your news on television or just through a few news outlets, the Washington Post or the New York Times, there is a very limited frame through which you get to see the wider world. And I know that YouTube is kind of put forward as, oh, that's where my child goes to watch Let's Play videos, or they have, videos of tractors, or whatever it is that people have an impression of YouTube. But also there is where new ideas are entering society about how the way the world ought to work. For example, this video here was written by a man named CGP Grey, who's a guy that lives over in the UK, and he makes videos that are seen by millions and millions of people. This particular video shocked me awake. Because while I've heard people talk about, hey, we should abolish the Electoral College, I am familiar with the way the Constitution works because I went to the 8th grade, and I realized that's very difficult. But in this video, CGP Grey lays out a path through which people could actually do an end run around the Electoral College. And for the 6 minutes that video took to watch, I thought for the first 4.5 minutes, ha ha ha, how funny this is. And then I get to the last 5% and I realize he's not kidding and this is real. And so you have to be able to look at national issues by where are the people on the edge of the world talking about them. Which leads me to the case that every single person in this room if you're using YouTube, if you have any way of using it, buy the subscription. And the reason that you should buy the subscription is because for the first time since mass media has occurred, you can use money to get back time in a dramatic way. Right now on YouTube, one of the reasons that people don't watch it is because every time you go to watch a video that's going to tell you something you care about, you've got to watch a 5-second ad or a 30-second ad. If you use the subscription, that's gone. You just start watching videos. As soon as you're done, you go to the next one. And this is important because it allows you to cycle through ideas much faster. And if you want to know what that edge of chaos is on national politics or things that are going on in the world, you want access to those without having an intermediator say, the only way you can see it is if you first watch my ad. But I think this is important because you should know what's going on at the national level, not just what the large media outlets say is there. And then finally, on the individual level, I'm sure there are people in this room that if I talk about the Oregon Trail, you instantly have memories of childhood and playing this game. I would make the case that the children today, some large percentage of them, will have the same feeling about this Navy SEAL, Jocko Willink, that we have about the Oregon Trail. Jocko Willink is a retired Navy SEAL, a massive guy. He makes videos and he has a podcast and he has a Twitter feed, but his whole world is built around, I am responsible for the problems that I see in the world and I'm the one that has to push back when something's going wrong. I can't look to other people to ask them to change, to get them to change their definition. And so this giant of a man, this huge hulking guy, started writing children's books. And I have never in my life seen a children's book take off like this. I have a nephew down in Costa Rica that read the Spanish version. 2 of my other nephews are waking up for the last 6 months, doing exercises, making their bed, straightening up their lives. This is a new phenomenon that's happening, and I think it's happening in response to all of this chaos that people feel in their lives. I don't know what the definition is. I don't know how to control all these things. I know what I'll do. I'll control myself. Now, because this talk was called The Edge of Chaos, I wanted to get a little bit edgy on who else I showed you so that you can go back when you're done with this conference and look up interesting people. And there is an interesting person that is the alter ego of Jocko. Jocko is the guy that from a very young age wanted to be a soldier, wanted to be a warrior, lifted, got strong, became that soldier, moved all the way up through the Navy SEALs, and became a man that all of us could look to and say, wow. His alter ego would be this man right here, Wes Watson, who spent 10 years in a federal prison, and when he came out, when he went in, he was a drug-dealing nobody that had made all sorts of mistakes. But when he came out, he used the lessons of Stoicism to figure out how to have discipline to change his life. Now, no one in this room will take me seriously until you go listen to this guy, but I have never been more inspired by somebody saying, your problems are your problems, you've got to fix them yourselves. And this is a rising tide in the world, individualism and Stoicism. So I'm going to come to some conclusions here. I know we have a futurist here, and I am not very good at making large-scale predictions. There's too much chaos for me to have a vision for what will happen. But I do want to make kind of a thank you to all of you. You see, I was with Monsanto for 5 years, and in that role, we did things that no one else had ever done before. We radically changed the conversation, and as a seed company, we did a very good job of pushing back against people that were afraid of us. Clearly not good enough if the glyphosate cases could all come down once Bayer bought it. But when Bayer took over Monsanto, they came to me and they said, we love what you've done, you and your team, this has been great. We want to give you a chance to move up in the executive ladder. So would you like to go to supply chain or finance? And so I sat there thinking, I have just been sprinting as hard as I can for the last 5 years because I believe this divide between what people think is being grown out in the fields and what is the most important problem in the history of civilization. I mean that. And so when those were my options, and they said, well, we don't really have a role to do the thing that you think is important, then I said, I've got to go. And so I left the company. Now imagine if you were me, and you have a wife, and you're trying to start a family, and you're talking with your father-in-law, who you respect and admire a great deal, and he cannot possibly understand why you've left to start your own consulting company and going out and giving talks like this, until June of last year. June of last year is when I came across a Peter Zehan video of him speaking at the Land Expo. And when I saw that speech, I was blown away by his level of sophistication and how quickly and how many ideas he could push in front of an audience. And I thought to myself, man, someday I want to have an audience where I can push the limit as intellectually hard as he did. And I sent that video to my father-in-law, who for the first time after watching the Land Expo saw what I was doing and understood where I'm trying to go. So this is a very important moment to me because I know how valuable everyone's attention is in this room. And I am deeply grateful for it. So I want to talk about some things that I think are on the edge of chaos that may impact your land values. This will only take a few moments. You remember that guy I talked about, Eric Ward. He is the president of a company called Ag Biome. What he was talking about in that speech that I referenced was that there have been no new active chemicals released into the United States agriculture in 20 years. It's done. Innovation has stopped, and maybe it will start back up again. I don't know. But my guess is the regulations that we have to deal with, things like the precautionary principle, are so out of control that it makes it nearly impossible for any company to say, first let's do 10 years of innovation, and then let's try and get it through the regulatory process. That's not going to happen. So what Eric Ward decided to do was to move into microbials, where they are naturally occurring in the soil, and they can high throughput sequence to find out, do these microbials have the same impact as what we were deriving from chemicals? For example, this is an electron microscope. The orange is a type of soybean rust. The blue is a microbial attaching to it and ripping it apart, and the green is the soybean leaf. Because they are naturally occurring, right now, under the US regulatory system, they are not regulated in the same way that chemicals are. So we are going to see a ton of innovation come out of the microbial space. Now, having been in agriculture for long enough to know, most of what is out there is snake oil. Most of what is out there won't work. But there are a few companies that are doing some very interesting things, and I think you would all do well to check out Ag Biome. I think Eric Ward is one of the most forward-thinking people in the United States right now, particularly in starting new biotech companies. Next, I would encourage you to go look up this idea, and I want you to challenge this idea of the sneaky end run around the Electoral College. I don't know if it'll happen, but I can guarantee you that if the change so dramatic as to no longer use the Electoral College comes to the United States, we will have thrown so much chaos into the system that there's no way of telling how things will shake out. It will be a dramatic change, and if that matters to you, you should see what the plan is. And then finally, Stoicism is something that's growing. If it's something that you've never heard of, then I would highly recommend going and following this Twitter handle right here. It's called Visualize Value. It is just black background with white writing, and he takes old Stoic philosophers and he puts them into graphics. And they're really about, what is it that I can control in my life? What sort of changes? What can I do? And at the end of the day, when you're fighting against the intransigent minority, that's all you have. Your ability to control you. Your ability to take care of the problems and to understand the issues that they're yelling about so loudly that they don't want you to think about the nuance of the idea. They just want you to follow their perspective. And that's why the other point of view that I have on the intransigent minority is anytime you hear someone say, that person should be silenced, we should not allow that group to speak, they should change what they're doing, you should do the opposite. And instead of listening to what they're saying and saying that person should not be allowed to talk, you should go seek that person out. This is Dr. Kevin Folta. We ended up doing a podcast well before this all happened here. I've known Dr. Folta for a long time. But the reason that I would recommend all of you go and listen to this podcast is you should know what a group of people did not want you to hear. That is the way you push back on people that want to control your access to information. I'm not saying that Kevin is without fault. I have no idea all of the nuances that went into it. But anytime somebody says, don't go listen to this person, you should start wondering, why is it that they don't want me to hear these ideas and think about them for myself? So I have a podcast called the Vance Crowe Podcast, and that's what I do. I interview experts that are like this. And there are many, many people that I have interviewed that are at the highest level of expertise, and they all say the same thing. I thought when I got here, people would want to hear from me, and now what happens is I get an opportunity to speak, and there are people out there saying it shouldn't happen because of my sex, because of what I talk about, because of any number of issues. This is a problem, and as landowners, as people that are going to be managing this country into the future, we must not allow the intransigent minority to tell you what people think and who's acceptable. So this has been a great honor. I am so very glad to be here because of all the places I've been in my 5 years of traveling and addressing various audiences, I've never seen one so willing to walk into the chaos, to step out onto that edge and to find new things that you don't agree with. And that is what allows the world to move forward, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse. So my hope for you today is that you spend time encountering ideas that you don't automatically agree with. Try and find out, is this something that I can learn from, and what can I use this for in a way that maybe even the presenter didn't expect? So thank you very much.
I know that your master's was focused on cross-cultural communication, and I'm curious to hear what you have to say about cross-generational communication. I think that there's a lot of difficulties going on between all the generations, but specifically when it comes to the millennial, which is I'm a part of, but also with the silent generation, or the Gen Xers and the boomers. Is there anything that you think can be done to help bridge the gap in the communication or the miscommunications that are occurring there?
That's a great question. So when people ask the question, am I a millennial, right, if you go around to crowds of people and you say, I'm the director of millennial engagement, then people are like, am I a millennial? What's the rules here? What's the age group? And I always talk about, you don't need to worry about the age group of what is somebody defined. When you're saying the word millennial or Gen X or Gen Y, what you're saying is there were ideas that were randomly crashing together somewhere out in the ocean, and now, for whatever reason, because of changes to technology or government or whatever, those ideas started getting in sync, and they started to have some order, and that order became a wave that was going to crash onto the shore of society. And so it's not going to become the shore, but it will change the shape of it. So the reason this is important is because a lot of times people are in generations not based on how old they are, but what are they paying attention to? What are they thinking about? What is the news that matters to them? Who do they trust? Who do they not trust? Who's in the in-group or the out-group? And I don't think there is ever going to be some robust solution, a way a company says, this is how we're going to get over intergenerational communications problems, because this is a problem time immemorial. You can go read Aristotle, and he talks about these exact same problems. At the end of the day, if you want to be more effective, if you want to have better communications with millennials or with some other generation, ask the people where they get their news. In fact, throughout this entire conference, I highly recommend, if you're trying to break the ice with somebody, ask them, where do you get your news? Are you getting it from television? Are you getting it from YouTube or podcasts? And only when you know where somebody gets their news can you start to get into their line of thinking and their flow. And so if you want to improve your generational communications, you have to be much, much more open, not just to what is the news I want to listen to, but I need to be exposed to what other people are listening to so that way I can balance out and understand where their ideas are coming from. All right, thank you so very much. I'll be here the rest of the time. Thank you.